All right, so this is Anthropologists Tossups that is essentially based from NAQT's You Gotta Know These Anthropologists. So there are about 20 toss-ups over all of those people that are featured and some of the works as well. Let's go ahead and get started. Toss-up number 1. This thinker studied the effects of economic change on behavioral patterns in the towns of Mojokuto and Tabanan in one work. In another work, he described the Swidden and Sawa systems of farming and examined the effects of Dutch rule on Indonesian agriculture productivity. This thinker described his method of ethnography, which attempted to describe the context of behaviors instead of just the behaviors themselves, as thick description, and wrote that man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun, in a work that outlined his case for symbolic anthropology. For 10 points, named this author of The Interpretation of Cultures. And that is Clifford Geertz. Clifford Geertz. Toss-up 2. This man asserted that culture was not a concrete reality and could not be directly observed in a collection that also contained a work that outlined an affinity based on either mutual or asymmetrical ritual antagonizing. This author of an essay collection, including On Joking Relationships, examined the importance of the different aspects of the horde in the titular Aboriginal society. Another book by him distinguished between ceremonial, technical, and moral customs, and posited that the titular Pacific people may have African or Melanesian roots. For 10 points, named this British anthropologist and proponent of structural functionalism, the author of the Andaman Islanders. And that is Alfred Radcliffe Brown. Toss-up 3. This author studied the Mundugamor, whose men and women were regressive, the Arapesh, whose men and women were both peaceful, and the Shambuli, whose men primped while the women worked. This person's conversations with James Baldwin were published in a Rap on Race. A girl living on Ta'u claimed to have lied to this anthropologist, which supported the fateful hoaxing argument of Derek Freeman. This anthropologist is best known for a work about adolescent girls living on a Pacific island. For 10 points, named this female anthropologist who wrote Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies and Coming of Age in Samoa. And that is Margaret Mead. Toss-up 4. One chapter in this book notes that virtue begins with when the process of gratitude becomes active, and is entitled Repaying One 10,000th. In addition to that one and a chapter about the dilemma of virtue, one chapter discusses the practice of shaking a baby's head and hands to put it through the motions of manners, and is entitled The Child Learns. For 10 points, identify this book, which introduced the concepts of shame culture and guilt culture, in addition to purporting to explain patterns of Japanese culture, written by Ruth Benedict. And that is The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. Toss-up 5. Her research was questioned by Christoph Boesch, who recorded lower levels of violence in the Thai forest after this woman had chronicled a war between the Kahama and Kasakela groups in the 1970s. Though her studies of such individuals as Flo, Frodo, and David Greybeard, the first to accept her presence, she observed family relationships and termite fishing sticks, the first instances of tool-making in non-human primates. For 10 points, identify this biologist who worked for 45 years in Tanzania's Gombe Stream National Park studying chimpanzees. And that is Jane Goodall. Toss-up 6. One chapter of this work discusses sleep crawling, and later chapters states that parents should focus on teaching their children how to think rather than what to think. Another section of this work describes a ritual where umbilical cords are thrown into the sea in order to bring good luck for fishing. This work states that women are appointed to the position of taupo, in which she prepares for kava ceremony and must maintain her virginity, but chicken blood supposedly could be used to avoid such an appointment. Derek Freeman accused the author of this book for falling for a faithful hoaxing in a work subtitled The Making and Unmaking of an Anthropological Myth. For 10 points, named this book, which profiles the youth from the island of Ta'u, written by Margaret Mead. And that is Coming of Age in Samoa. Toss-up 7. This man worked at Mailu before his more famous work. This man argued that the most psychological complexes are cultural rather than universal, most prominently the Oedipus complex, and while he was a functionalist, this man's work focused on culture meeting the needs of individuals. This man served as an advisor to Jomo Kenyatta and spent a decade conducting ethnographic research in the Trobriand Islands, writing Sex and Repression in a Savage Society and detailing the Kulering. For 10 points, named this Polish-American sociologist, author of The Argonauts of the Western Pacific. And that is Bronislaw Malinowski. Toss-up 8. This man often used myths of the Bororo as examples and discussed the development of etiquette from a free code to compulsory in his The Origin of Table Manners. That work appeared along with another that claims the transition from nature to culture comes through the heating of food. This man's The Raw and the Cooked. This man developed a school in his field through such works as the elementary structures of kinship. For 10 points, name this writer of Mythologiques, a French anthropologist who wrote Structural Anthropology. And that is Claude Lévi-Strauss. Toss-up number 9. This author of folklore in the Old Testament described how Nicaraguans abstained from eating chocolate during the harvest in The Influence of the Sexes on Vegetation, a section of his greatest work, which also has chapters on Our Debt to the Savage and The Corn Spirit as an Animal. That work examines the relationship between customs, magic, and religion. For 10 points, name this Scottish anthropologist who wrote about shared folklore in his 1935 work, The Golden Bough. And that is James Fraser. Toss-up number 10. This thinker described an arc of culture that different peoples would draw from to create individual cultures in a work that used adjectives like restraint and abandon to describe different tribes. This thinker described a type of moral debt known as giri that is repaid through clearing one's name. This thinker analyzed the Zuni, Dobu, and Kwakiutl in a work that defined culture as personality writ large. This author of Patterns of Culture wrote a book which contrasted Japan's shame culture with the U.S.'s guilt culture. For 10 points, name this American anthropologist who wrote The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. And that is Ruth Benedict. Toss-up 11. This man wrote that Brighton's observations of the tidal varying vocalizations were not evidence of cultural inferiority on alternating sounds. To catalog environmental influences on native migration in the central Eskimo, he studied the Inuit of Baffin Island. He studied the practice of potlatch among the Kwakiutl, which led him to develop the concept of cultural relativism. He founded the anthropology department at Columbia, where he trained students such as Alfred L. Kruber and Ruth Benedict. For 10 points, name this anthropologist the author of The Mind of Primitive Man. That is Franz Boas. Toss-up 12. This man's discovery of pollen samples near Crater Lakes lent credence to the three-epoch model of the history of Easter Island, which he suggested was the original island to bear the name Rapa. This man was accused of racism after he visited the rock carvings at the Azerbaijani site of Gobustan and concluded that the Aesir originated from there. This man documented the success of a papyrus construction in his work, The Ra Expeditions. This man directed an Academy Award-winning documentary based on his most famous feat, which was named for the Incan sun god and sought to prove plausible contact between South America and Polynesia. For 10 points, name this Norwegian ethnologist who sailed thousands of miles on board his raft, the Kon-Tiki. And that's Thor Heyerdahl. Toss-up number 13. This work divided sympathetic magic into homeopathic and contagious magic, the latter of which can be explained by the function of voodoo dolls. It begins by describing the ritual murder of the priest Nemi, and analysis of the crucifixion led to the criticism of its author. This work discusses the worship and sacrifice of divine beings known as kings of the wood, and it was named after an object utilized to gain access to the underworld in the Aeneid. For 10 points, name this work of comparative religion and mythology written by James Fraser. And that is The Golden Bough. Toss-up 14. In one work, this thinker criticized A.P. Elkin's classification of 4 varieties of the tidal phenomenon and identified that phenomenon as an illusion based on 4 relationships between nature and culture. This author of The Way of the Masks and Totemism also made use of binary opposites as a part of a method he advocated of analyzing cultural systems in terms of the interrelationships between their elements. The author of The Elementary Structures of Kinship and Mythologiques, for 10 points, named this French anthropologist who promoted structuralism. And that is Claude Lévi-Strauss. Toss-up 15. This anthropologist used the studies by Rio Fortune of the Dobu tribe, identifying them as treacherous in a work that also studied the Kwakiutl and Zuni. The examples of restraint in Pueblo cultures and abandon in the Great Plains in that work, Patterns of Culture, are examples of her definition of culture as personality writ large. This anthropologist used newspapers and recordings in a work of anthropology at a distance because of her inability to visit a country during World War II. That work contrasts the guilt and shame cultures of America and Japan. For 10 points, name this author of The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. And that is Ruth Benedict. Toss-up 16. Late in life, this man studied the rock carvings at Gobustan in Azerbaijan, where he claimed to have found evidence of longships. To protest conflict in East Africa, he burned his reed boat, the Tigris. Aku Aku detailed his theories about Easter Island, but his best-known book told how he sailed on a balsa wood raft from South America to Polynesia. For 10 points, name this Norwegian explorer who wrote Kon-Tiki. And that is Thor Heyerdahl. Toss-up 17. Two of this scientist's research subjects were the polio-stricken Mr. McGregor and David Greybeard. Important discoveries by this anthropologist was that her subjects ate meat, even hunting colobus monkeys, and used tools such as using straws to pick up termites to eat. Goliath was the alpha male in her community at Gombe Stream National Park. For 10 points, name this woman who spent over 4 decades in Tanzania studying chimpanzees. And that is Jane Goodall. Toss-up number 18. In this man's essay, The Methods of Ethnology, he argued that it is more important to document the way in which an individual reacts to his whole social environment as opposed to the system of beliefs within the tribe. Author of Race and Democratic Society, this man advocated cultural relativism and disagreed with Lewis H. Morgan over the direction of change in family structure among the Kwakiutl. Some of this man's pupils were Alfred Kroeber and Edward Sapir. For 10 points, name this former professor of anthropology at Columbia University and father of American anthropology who wrote The Mind of Primitive Man. And that is Franz Boas. Toss-up 19. This author of the autobiography Blackberry Winter also wrote a work on gender roles called Male and Female. The Mundugamor are described as aggressive, the Arapesh as patriarchal, and Shambuli as semi-matriarchal in this anthropologist's Sex and Temperament in the Three Primitive Societies, the third work of a trilogy. Derek Freeman criticized the first work of that trilogy for faithful hoaxing in its description of Taupo, a virgin princess. In that work, she contrasted female American adolescents with their sexually active counterparts in Polynesia. For 10 points, name this anthropologist who wrote about the young women of Ta'u in Coming of Age in Samoa. And that is Margaret Mead. Toss-up number 20. This anthropologist studied African race relations in his The Dynamics of Culture Change and discussed the dichotomy between the sacred and the profane in his Magic, Science, and Religion. He wrote the introduction to his students, Facing Mount Kenya, and this thinker refuted the Oedipus complex in his Sex and Repression in Savage Society. His most famous work studies the Coolering system of the Trobriand Islanders, whom he also analyzed in Coral Gardens and Their Magic. For 10 points, name this Polish anthropologist who wrote Argonauts of the Western Pacific, and that is Bronislaw Malinowski. And that's all it is for that, but I have another one for anthropology. So stay tuned.